He started as a bookkeeper, a quiet man from Cleveland with a fascination for numbers, discipline, and divine order. No one could have imagined that within a single lifetime, John D. Rockefeller would control 90% of America's oil, the single most valuable resource of the industrial age. Governments tried to stop him, rivals tried to destroy him, and in the end, they all failed. Because Rockefeller didn't just build a company, he built a system, a machine that could survive any law, any reform, and even the man himself. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance, it was design. Welcome to The Financial Historians, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Before Rockefeller became a symbol of greed or a saint of philanthropy, he was simply a product of his time, and his time was ruthless. The mid-1800s were an age of chaos disguised as progress. The United States was reforging itself after Civil War. Cities were booming, railroads were stretching across the continent, and factories roared day and night. New inventions, telegraphs, steel mills, steamships, were transforming a nation of farmers into a modern industrial empire. But every machine needs fuel. Every boom needs something to burn. And at that moment, the world's lights still ran on oil. Not the sleek black gold we think of today, but a foul, sticky liquid that could be refined into kerosene. The magic that lit lamps before electricity conquered the night. In small towns like Titusville, Pennsylvania, men drilled holes in the ground and struck fortunes overnight. Wooden derricks rose like forests. Barrels rolled down muddy streets, and every man with a shovel thought he could strike it rich. It was a new kind of gold rush, and like every rush, it brought madness. Oil gushed faster than markets could handle. Prices crashed, then soared, then crashed again. There were no safety standards, no regulations, no rules, only speculation. One year, a refinery owner might be a millionaire. The next, he'd be bankrupt. Fortunes were built and lost with the rhythm of a roulette wheel. It was capitalism's wild frontier, a land of chaos, waste, and fire. And that's where John D. Rockefeller entered the story. Born in 1839 in upstate New York, Rockefeller grew up with two lessons engraved deep in his soul. From his mother, a devout Baptist, he learned discipline, prayer, and the sacred duty of thrift. From his father, a traveling salesman and a con man who sold fake cures, he learned never to trust chaos. He grew up believing that disorder was sin and control was salvation. At 16, Rockefeller took his first job as a bookkeeper in Cleveland. He earned 50 cents a day, but what mattered wasn't the money, it was the structure. He fell in love with the beauty of balance sheets, the way every number could find its place, every debt could be reconciled. He saw in accounting a kind of moral order, proof that the world could make sense if someone just kept the ledger straight. He once said, "I would rather earn 1% on 100 men's efforts than 100% on my own." It wasn't arrogance, it was arithmetic. He already understood leverage, the quiet force that multiplies effort. When Rockefeller looked at the oil business, he didn't see adventure. He saw waste. He saw chaos. Refineries competing like gamblers, undercutting prices, dumping oil into rivers, spilling profits along with fuel. He saw men chasing fortune with no plan, no discipline, no structure. In 1863, at just 24 years old, Rockefeller invested in a small oil refinery in Cleveland. It was a modest operation, wooden barrels, crude equipment, a few workers, but he saw its potential. He studied every cost, every shipment, every drop of oil that came through the door. Within a few years, his obsession with efficiency turned that small refinery into one of the best-run operations in the country. 7 years later, he created Standard Oil of Ohio. From that moment, Rockefeller began imposing order on an industry that had none. While his competitors gambled, he negotiated. He struck secret deals with railroads, agreements that gave him rebates on shipping costs and even discounts on his competitors' shipments. It meant he could move oil cheaper than anyone else. When his rivals protested, he bought them out, often at prices they couldn't refuse. When they resisted, he undercut them until they surrendered. He didn't need to shout or threaten. He just made it impossible for them to compete. By 1879, Standard Oil refined more than 90% of America's oil. From Pennsylvania to New York to Ohio, his pipelines and refineries stretched like veins across the map. It was the most powerful company in the country, and the most hated. To Rockefeller, what looked like monopoly was simply efficiency. He believed chaos was evil, and order was moral. He once told a reporter, "Competition is a sin." To him, it wasn't greed, it was perfection. Every barrel, every cent, every inch of pipeline had to be optimized. Waste was sin. Precision was virtue. He understood something most businessmen of his era never grasped. Wealth isn't about producing more. It's about controlling flow. The oil industry had three parts: drilling, refining, and distribution. Most companies chose one. Rockefeller wanted all three. He bought pipelines. He bought tanker cars. He bought barrel factories, warehouses, shipping terminals. He even controlled the agents who sold kerosene in distant towns. He didn't just sell oil. He owned the arteries that moved it. Anyone who wanted to enter the market had to pass through his system. He turned industry into infrastructure, and he built that infrastructure to serve one purpose: permanence. But Rockefeller's true innovation wasn't in oil, it was in structure. In 1882, he created something entirely new: the Standard Oil Trust. It was a network of dozens of companies tied together under a single management board. Each subsidiary looked independent on paper, but in reality, they all answered to one invisible hand, his. It was the first corporate superstructure in history. A machine of ownership, a system so well organized that it could control prices, production, and profits across multiple states. It was the prototype for the modern conglomerate, and it gave birth to a new word in the American vocabulary: trust. Soon, trust would become synonymous with monopoly, but at that moment, Rockefeller saw it as evolution, the next logical step in capitalism's design. Under his rule, kerosene prices fell by nearly 80%. Consumers paid less. Efficiency soared. To the public, this looked like progress. To his rivals, it was tyranny. Politicians began to sense the danger. Standard Oil wasn't just a company anymore. It was a government unto itself. An invisible empire of refineries, railroads, and lawyers. Reporters began calling Rockefeller the most hated man in America. And yet, those who met him in person saw someone entirely different: soft-spoken, polite, methodical. He dressed simply, avoided scandal, and quoted the Bible daily. He lived as though wealth were a moral duty, proof of divine favor earned through discipline. He told his employees that thrift was virtue, waste was sin, and industry was prayer. He wasn't loud like Vanderbilt or ruthless like Gould. He was something far more dangerous: patient. Where others chased profit, he built systems. Where others fought for control, he made control inevitable. By the dawn of the 1880s, Rockefeller wasn't just the richest man in America. He was something new, a kind of industrial architect. He had taken the chaos of the frontier and turned it into a machine, and that machine would reshape capitalism itself. By the late 1800s, the name Standard Oil had become both a marvel and a menace. To the public, it symbolized efficiency, clean kerosene lighting homes across America at a fraction of the old cost. To its enemies, it was a suffocating empire, swallowing every competitor that dared to rise. And at the center of it all was John D. Rockefeller, calm, unreadable, and unstoppable. He rarely spoke in public. He let numbers, contracts, and structure do the talking. While others bragged about their fortunes, Rockefeller hid behind the machinery of his empire. He never needed to shout. the world bent quietly around him. He didn't just dominate oil. He redesigned the very idea of business. He made corporate control an art form. Every move was deliberate, every dollar accounted for, every decision filtered through the lens of order, and that order produced profits so vast that even his accountants sometimes couldn't believe the totals. Yet power, no matter how disciplined, always creates enemies. Rockefeller's web of rail deals and secret rebates became an open secret. Rival refiners accused him of corruption, of crushing competition, not through better product, but through backroom manipulation. They claimed he didn't play fair, but fairness had never been the goal. To Rockefeller, fairness was just another word for inefficiency. In Cleveland, he used a strategy that would later be called the Cleveland Massacre. He quietly bought out nearly every competing refinery in the city, one by one. He offered generous prices at first, friendly, almost merciful. Those who refused soon faced a different kind of mercy, relentless price wars that drove them to bankruptcy. When they could no longer hold out, Rockefeller was there again, the quiet savior, ready to buy them for pennies. By the end, nearly all the city's refineries belonged to Standard Oil. He repeated this method everywhere. It wasn't brute force, it was precision. He never wasted energy on chaos. He conquered through inevitability. Standard Oil soon spread beyond Cleveland, beyond Ohio, beyond even oil. Rockefeller controlled railroads, tanker ships, barrel factories, warehouses, pipelines, and distribution centers. He built a network so vast that oil could travel from well to lamp under his supervision alone. No competitor could match that reach. He didn't just sell oil, he controlled its entire life cycle. By 1880, Standard Oil was producing, refining, and shipping more oil than most nations. And in the process, Rockefeller became the richest man in America. But power attracts attention, and attention attracts scrutiny. As his empire grew, so did public resentment. Small refiners complained to Congress. Journalists began to dig. Ordinary Americans, who once celebrated industry's rise, started asking if one man could be allowed to control so much of something the world depended on. The backlash had begun. In 1904, a woman named Ida Tarbell published a series of articles that would shake the foundation of Rockefeller's empire. Her father had been one of those independent oil men ruined by Standard Oil's tactics. For years she collected documents, letters, and testimonies, building a case that exposed the hidden machinery of Rockefeller's empire. Her book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, was more than journalism. It was a public reckoning. Tarbell's writing painted Rockefeller as a quiet predator, a man who cloaked ruthless ambition behind religion and reason. She described his secret railroad rebates, his coercive buyouts, his use of intimidation masked as business logic. Her tone was measured, but her evidence was devastating. For the first time, the American public could see the architecture of power laid bare. The outrage was immediate. Newspapers called Rockefeller the face of monopoly, the embodiment of unchecked capitalism. He became a villain in political cartoons, a giant octopus whose tentacles wrapped around Congress, railroads, and the press. To many Americans, Standard Oil wasn't a company anymore. It was an empire that ruled without a crown. Rockefeller, as always, remained silent. He refused interviews, avoided public debate, and hid behind a wall of lawyers and accountants. When asked about Tarbell's accusations, he simply said, "Not all the facts are correct." And that was it. His calm infuriated his critics even more. But behind that calm exterior, the pressure was mounting. Politicians could no longer ignore the storm. The Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890 to combat monopolies, had rarely been used effectively. Now, Standard Oil made it unavoidable. In 1906, the U.S. government formally sued Rockefeller's company for violating antitrust law, marking the beginning of one of the most famous legal battles in American history. The case dragged on for years, Rockefeller was interrogated, his company audited, his allies questioned. In court, Standard Oil's lawyers argued that the company's success wasn't coercion, it was competence. They claimed that Standard Oil had reduced prices, improved quality, and created stability in a once chaotic market. How could that be a crime? But public opinion had turned. Rockefeller had become too powerful, too rich, too secretive. In the eyes of the people, he wasn't stabilizing capitalism, he was consuming it. Finally, in 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict. Standard Oil was declared a monopoly and ordered to be broken up into 34 independent companies. The headlines called it a victory for democracy, the moment when the American government proved it could still tame the giants of industry. Crowds cheered, politicians celebrated, and for the first time in decades, it seemed Rockefeller had been defeated. But he hadn't been, because while the public saw destruction, Rockefeller saw multiplication. He owned roughly a quarter of the shares in each of those new companies, and once they were split, investors rushed to buy them. The combined value of the 34 firms, names that would later become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, tripled within a year. In breaking his empire, the government had accidentally made him richer than ever. It was a paradox worthy of Rockefeller himself, a man who built systems that turned defeat into leverage. He once said, "God gave me money." But what he really had was structure. He had built an organism so adaptive that even dismantling it only made it stronger. By 1913, Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire. Adjusted for today's dollars, his fortune would exceed 400 billion, greater than Musk, Bezos, and Buffett combined. And yet, he was already shifting to a different kind of power. The empire of oil had been conquered. Now he turned to something that could last even longer: legitimacy. He understood what few industrialists of his age ever did, that wealth without moral cover invites destruction. So Rockefeller began to reinvent himself. He withdrew from daily business. He devoted himself to giving, to science, medicine, and education, to philanthropy that could outlive the stigma of monopoly. He once said, "I believe every right implies a responsibility," and with that belief, he started building his next empire, not of oil, but of influence. He poured hundreds of millions into universities, Chicago, Columbia, and Spelman. He funded research into public health, sanitation, and medicine. His foundation attacked diseases like yellow fever and hookworm. He built an infrastructure of generosity as methodical as his business empire, organized, efficient, and tax-proof. To his critics, it was image laundering. To his admirers, it was vision. Either way, it worked. The robber baron became the benefactor. The villain became the philanthropist. Rockefeller had discovered the final truth about power. If you can't escape public judgment, outlive it. If you can't erase your past, rewrite it in marble. The same precision that once refined oil now refined his legacy. And as his foundations spread across the world, Rockefeller's influence seeped quietly into education, science, and politics, invisible but permanent. What began as a struggle to control oil had become something much larger. Rockefeller was no longer building an industry. He was building a blueprint, a formula for power that would echo long after he was gone. By the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller had done something few men in history ever achieved. He had transcended defeat. The government had shattered his empire, the press had vilified his name, and yet, like oil seeping through cracks, his influence flowed on, invisible, unstoppable, and everywhere. Standard Oil no longer existed, but its DNA lived on in 34 new corporations, each one independent in name, but all born from the same design, the same structure, discipline, and efficiency that Rockefeller had perfected. Within a decade, those fragments dominated the world market. Their combined profits dwarfed what Standard Oil had once made. And the man who supposedly lost everything had, in truth, created a self-replicating organism of wealth. Rockefeller had discovered something deeper than monopoly. He had found the formula for immortality, not of the body, but of the system. He understood that power isn't about owning things. It's about designing how things work. If you control the flow of oil, of money, of influence, you don't need to rule directly. You can step back, and the system will keep compounding on its own. By the 1920s, the Rockefeller fortune had evolved beyond industry. It spread into banking, insurance, real estate, and global finance. The Rockefellers invested through holding companies and trusts so complex that even experts struggled to map them. They owned pipelines in Texas, rail lines in the Midwest, and banks in New York, all connected through layers of corporate architecture. Rockefeller himself had retired from active business. He spent his later years at his estate in Pocantico Hills, rising at dawn, reading scripture, walking among his gardens. He lived simply, modestly, almost like a monk, giving away money with the same precision he once used to make it. He told his children that charity should be conducted like business, efficient, targeted, and accountable. But his philanthropy wasn't just kindness, it was engineering. Each donation built influence. Each foundation created networks that reached into government, science, and culture. The Rockefeller Foundation, founded in 1913, became one of the most powerful private institutions on earth. It funded universities, laboratories, and medical breakthroughs. It shaped modern public health policy, built hospitals, and sent doctors across the world. Over time, Rockefeller's money quietly molded the world he had once only supplied with oil. His foundation helped eradicate hookworm and yellow fever. It financed the creation of the University of Chicago and transformed it into a powerhouse of economics and research. It influenced education standards, medical schools, and even the creation of the United Nations. Through philanthropy, Rockefeller discovered a new form of leverage, moral leverage. He turned wealth into virtue and virtue into power. The same hands that once signed secret railroad rebates now signed checks for vaccines and scholarships. And just like that, history began to forgive him. The press that once called him a monster now called him a benefactor. Politicians who condemned him now sought his approval. The empire of oil had been replaced by an empire of goodwill, and both were built on the same principle: control the infrastructure. Rockefeller had mastered the art of owning the pipes, first the literal ones that carried oil, then the invisible ones that carried influence. He didn't just build refineries, he built systems of flow. Money flowed through his companies, ideas flowed through his foundations, and those flows shaped the world around them. The system he built became the blueprint for 20th century capitalism. His trust model inspired modern conglomerates. His idea of vertical integration, controlling every stage from production to sale, became the gospel of business schools. His understanding of scale, leverage, and efficiency became the backbone of global corporations. Companies like General Motors, IBM, and later Apple and Amazon would unknowingly follow the Rockefeller playbook: start with a breakthrough, dominate an emerging market, control the infrastructure. Then, when success invites regulation, pivot, become the benefactor, the innovator, the savior of progress. The Rockefeller algorithm was born: consolidate chaos into order, turn order into dominance, then rebrand dominance as virtue. Every modern empire of wealth, from oil to data, still follows it. Google controls the flow of information, Amazon controls the flow of goods, Apple controls the flow of design and desire. Different materials, same machine. And whenever governments try to intervene, the pattern repeats. Antitrust laws break a company apart, investors cheer, and the fragments grow stronger than before. The same principle that made Standard Oil indestructible lives on. Once a system becomes essential, you can't destroy it. You can only redistribute its pieces. By the 1930s, Rockefeller was an old man. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. Carnegie, Morgan, Vanderbilt. He had watched the automobile, the airplane, and the skyscraper rise, all powered by the fuel his refineries had once perfected. The world was running on oil, and that oil still carried his fingerprints. He would sometimes joke that he wanted to live to 100. He almost did. He died in 1937 at the age of 97, in his sleep, calm and content. By then, he had donated more than $500 million to charity, a sum worth billions today. But his greatest legacy wasn't the money he gave away. It was the architecture he left behind. That architecture became the invisible skeleton of the modern economy. Corporations that span continents, markets that appear free but move under hidden coordination, philanthropy that doubles as influence, systems of wealth that evolve faster than the laws meant to contain them. The trust had been outlawed, but its logic had won. Governments could regulate, but never truly outpace the structure Rockefeller designed. It was too efficient, too adaptive, too embedded, and perhaps the most profound part of Rockefeller's legacy is psychological. He changed how society thinks about wealth itself. Before him, wealth was often seen as luck, inheritance, or daring. After him, it became design. He taught the world that riches were not an accident. They were engineered outcomes of disciplined systems. He didn't discover oil. He discovered leverage. He didn't invent a product. He invented a pattern, a way of thinking about power that could survive any reform, any revolution, any century. Even now, the shadow of that thinking defines our world. Tech giants speak of innovation, efficiency, and progress, the same words Rockefeller used a century ago. Their founders, like him, believe they're bringing order to chaos. And like him, they believe their dominance is not greed, but perfection. Rockefeller's real genius wasn't that he became the richest man in history. It was that he turned capitalism itself into a self-reinforcing loop, a machine that could perpetuate wealth, justify itself, and call the process moral. The government could break up Standard Oil, but it could never break the idea behind it. And that idea became the unspoken code of modern capitalism. A code written by a quiet man from Cleveland who started as a bookkeeper and ended as the architect of the economic universe we still live in. By the time John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, the world had changed in ways he could scarcely have imagined, and in ways he had quietly engineered. The lamps that kerosene once lit had been replaced by electricity. Automobiles roared across highways, powered by the oil he had once refined. Airplanes soared across continents. Plastics molded industries, and modern cities pulsed with energy his pipelines had once carried. And yet, the systems he built endured, evolving silently, invisibly, like rivers beneath the surface. His fortune did not die with him. It multiplied, spread, and adapted. The Rockefeller family diversified into finance, real estate, and international business. They created foundations, think tanks, and institutions that could influence policy, science, and culture without ever drawing attention. The same principles that allowed Standard Oil to dominate the oil market now allowed his family's wealth to dominate ideas, influence, and global structures. The Rockefeller formula: dominate a new resource, resist regulation until unstoppable, then rebrand through philanthropy, became the unspoken playbook for every billionaire who followed. From tech to media, from finance to energy, the pattern repeats. First, find a new resource, whether data, attention, or energy. Second, control the infrastructure, the pipelines, the servers, the platforms. Third, when public opinion turns or laws catch up, pivot into legitimacy, foundations, charitable giving, and narrative control. History shows this pattern in action again and again. AT&T, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, all scaled fast, dominated markets, and only apologized once the systems were too large to dismantle. The lesson Rockefeller left us is clear. The moment you control the flow of value, you become almost untouchable. Not by might, not by charm, but by design. Even the antitrust actions that once sought to contain him now read like a footnote in his strategy. When Standard Oil was broken into fragments, the sum of its parts exceeded the original, and the same is true for modern conglomerates. Break up a tech giant, and its pieces often thrive independently, more valuable, more efficient, more dominant than before. Rockefeller had proven that systems, once built to scale, behave like matter under gravity. They bend the world around them. You cannot destroy them. You can only redistribute their orbit. Yet Rockefeller's life was not merely about domination. It was also a lesson in the paradox of morality and power. He preached Sunday school and destroyed competitors in the same breath. He gave away half his fortune while ensuring the other half compounded indefinitely. He believed wealth was a gift from God, but it was also a product of design, structure, and discipline. Through this lens, Rockefeller's legacy is both cautionary and instructive. It shows the immense power of systems, their ability to outlive the men who build them. It shows that wealth, when engineered properly, does not merely accumulate. It multiplies, evolves, and adapts. It shows that influence and reputation are as important as capital. And it shows that history does not favor the strongest in brute terms. It favors the most adaptable, the most patient, the most systematic. By the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller network was quietly embedded in global finance, public health, and higher education. Rockefeller funded research, helped eradicate diseases, advanced scientific knowledge, and shaped modern education. It reached beyond borders, influencing policy, governments, and global institutions. In other words, the flow of influence mirrored the flow of oil. And in both cases, the architecture Rockefeller had designed ensured it never stopped. The psychological legacy is perhaps the most profound. Rockefeller taught the world that wealth isn't luck. It isn't about being in the right place at the right time. It's about engineering leverage. It's about designing systems that reproduce advantage and control the flow of resources. He didn't merely make money, he made inevitability, and this principle endures. Today, tech giants, energy conglomerates, and global investment firms operate on the same invisible rules Rockefeller pioneered. They scale rapidly, they dominate markets, they pivot to philanthropy when scrutiny rises. They structure themselves to survive regulation, litigation, and public backlash. Even modern economies bear his imprint. Corporations that span continents, monopolies disguised as competitive markets, foundations that wield soft power, these are all part of the architecture he left behind. Every time legislation lags behind innovation, every time public scrutiny arrives too late, the pattern repeats. The engine of control, once built, continues to move, quietly, invisibly, inexorably. By the end of his life, Rockefeller's empire was no longer about oil alone. It was about infrastructure. The infrastructure of markets, influence, and power itself. He had discovered that controlling the movement of value is more important than controlling the value itself. He had turned capitalism into a system that could survive laws, reforms, and even death. And in doing so, he built the DNA of modern business. John D. Rockefeller didn't invent oil. He invented the modern concept of power. He discovered that real wealth lies not in barrels or bank accounts, but in the systems that keep the flow moving. He showed that control, discipline, and foresight could outlast markets, governments, and even public opinion. He began as a man counting pennies in a ledger. He ended as the architect of capitalism's DNA, and his lessons echo still. The world is a machine, Systems endure. Wealth flows where it is designed to flow. And the quiet, patient architect is the one who bends history itself. John D. Rockefeller taught us that fortune is not accidental. It is engineered. It is structural. It is inevitable. The world he built continues to run on the same invisible tracks, pipelines of money, networks of influence, and systems of control. The faces have changed. The tools have evolved, but the engine remains. It is his blueprint, his algorithm, and his lasting power. And whether we recognize it or not, we still live inside John D. Rockefeller's system. Every corporation, every market, every foundation, every regulation responds to the patterns he discovered. The oil may have changed to data, attention, or innovation. The pipes may be digital rather than steel, but the flow and the rules that govern it remain. History is not just a story of men, it is a story of systems, and Rockefeller was the first to build one that outlives even the man himself. He started as a bookkeeper, he died as the architect of modern power, and in between, he taught the world the single most important lesson in capitalism: control the flow and you control the future.